Hello, gardeners. Welcome to another Monday where we talk about gardening. You'll get a lot of your gardening questions answered. And on today's show, I really want to start focusing on garden planning, starting to think about how you're going to approach your next gardening season because it's never too early. Thank you to everyone who's already checked in, those who are checking in now, and for those of you that are watching on replay. We've got 90 minutes of some great gardening conversation, gardening questions, gardening answers. Let's go ahead and get started with one that Luz Robles was asking, wondering about how to store fruit, specifically in a pantry baskets, and most of the concern being in dark conditions. Well, a lot of it depends on the fruit that you're trying to save. Overall, basically, don't worry about dark conditions. Most of the fruit that we harvest that will continue to ripen, it's not the light that's causing the fruit to ripen. It's the release of ethylene gas. And so it's the gases that cause a lot of the fruit to ripen, especially apples and bananas. The one thing to think about, at least for me, when I store things in my pantry in the dark, is I often forget about them. So I do a lot of my storage right on the counter. For some of the fruits that can handle cold temperatures, like pears and apples, I'll put them in the refrigerator. They'll tend to last a little bit longer. I also do a lot of preservation. So one of the best ways that I store my fruit is by freezing it, making it into jelly, or dehydrating it and using it later as a fruit leather. So don't worry too much about storing things in pantry. Do be aware of the type of fruit though, because some fruits, when they rest in a basket and their skins are touching, might tend to rot or at least soften when they're exposed to that condition, which is another reason I'd leave them out on the counter so that they can be separated and I can keep an eye on them and remind myself what it is I'm storing and what it is I need to eat. So great to see everybody clicking in today. I saw BK checking in from the Netherlands. This is a worldwide gardening community and you are all loaded with questions and answers. So please participate as part of the chat and be part of the Gardener Scott gardening community. Stefan is saying hello, everyone. Rachel, good morning from Maryland. Denver 1865 is talking about some Cyber Monday sales. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to seeds as well. This could be a day to get some of the seeds for those of you that are thinking about it. MG is also checking in from the Netherlands. That's great. Jay Dixon says, reminder, please read the live stream guidance below. And thanks, Jay. Jay's one of the moderators. And if you have a question, as Jay points out, go ahead and read in the description below. I'm more likely to see your question if you address it specifically to me. If you're asking a question and you don't put Gardener Scott in it, often I'll assume that it's part of the stream going back and forth where maybe someone else in the chain has asked a question and answered a question. So address it to me and I'm more likely to answer it, but I can't get to everything. So I'll try to address as much as I can. Bilkis, hello from Los Angeles. Anne-Marie, hello to you. Dina from Arizona. Laura from Arvada, Colorado. Slightly Stacy, shalom from Florida to you as well. And Barb in West Michigan. I say it every week. This is just such an incredible group of gardeners from everywhere. And it's so nice that we can all get together and share some time on Monday. It never ceases to amaze me. Mage Grey Wolf was also asking about ideas for deterring squirrels. Now, I've answered this much more in depth in previous live streams, but as Doris Miller pointed out, I think the best way to deal with squirrels in your garden is to get them away from your garden. Once they find your garden, it's really hard to do much. As you point out, chicken wire doesn't do much good. You can plant the plants that are supposed to deter squirrels, but I don't think they work very well. The idea is to get them completely away from your garden by setting up another area that is more appealing to them. So you can set up a squirrel feeding station. Now, I've heard discussions about this saying, yes, but if you start feeding the squirrels, you'll have more squirrels move in. Well, it's really not that likely. There is a population limit, and when the squirrels get too populated in your area, they're not going to be moving in because there's just not enough food to eat. Even if you feed squirrels, you're not going to get an influx of squirrels. You're just going to take the squirrels that you have and give them another area to eat. And this was very effective in my last garden. My neighbors had about half a dozen bird feeders, and that's where the squirrels hung out. They never came into my garden. And my brother and sister-in-law have squirrel feeders with nuts set up on their fence. They never have a problem with squirrels getting into the garden. Now, it is an extra expense. It is an extra activity that you have to deal with as far as feeding the squirrels, but they'll stay out of your garden if you take that little bit of extra work, and that tends to be the most effective. Rather than trying to create barriers, they're smart little creatures, and they'll get over fences and under fences, and you're spending just as much time and money trying to deter them as you would just making them happy someplace else. Thanos is saying, Gardener Scott, you mentioned in a live before that water treated with chlorine does not harm bacteria. Can you please elaborate and mention the Canadian channel you saw that on? There are bacteria everywhere, and chlorine will kill bacteria, but particularly in tap water and the water that we're going to be using in our garden, bacteria will start to repopulate it. And the chlorine that's often used in water evaporates very quickly. So when you water your garden with water from the hose that comes from your house, the chlorine's going to be gone. It's really not going to damage it. And there was some really good research that was done by Stephen. The channel is Alberta Urban Garden. He hasn't released any videos for a few years now, but he's got dozens and dozens of videos where he does a lot of analysis and a lot of research. And that's the video, Alberta Urban Garden, where he shows the laboratory analysis that he did with different waters to show that the bacteria really isn't affected by just using a little bit of chlorine in the water that we're using in our garden. Patrick, thank you for that super chat. Hello from Trinidad, Colorado. Is it necessary to sterilize seed starting mix to prevent fungus gnats? I use your formula for my mix. I don't think so. It is possible that if you buy some seed mixes that they might have the fungus gnat eggs in them. That's one of those creatures that even when I make my own mix and I start with sterilized materials, inevitably, after a month or two, the fungus gnats just find it. So I don't think it's necessary to sterilize because initially the material is sterilized. But once you start using it, it's going to wake up. Bacteria, fungi, all the other natural things that are floating in the air, those spores, those small eggs, they're going to find that material and it's not going to be sterile anymore. So that's one of those steps that I don't think is necessary, sterilizing your potting mixes, because it's only sterile for a brief period. And you really don't want sterile mixes because the plants are going to need the nutrients from the mix. And it's the bacteria that really make a lot of those nutrients available to the plants. If you plant in a sterile potting mix, you will need to use a fertilizer that is soluble and immediately available for the plants. Nothing wrong with that. Just realize that a sterile material means it's sterile and it's really not going to benefit the plants much. The fungus gnats are just going to find it. One of the best ways to battle fungus gnats is to try to keep the surface of the soil mix dry because it's a fungus gnat. It likes moist conditions. You can also take cinnamon and sprinkle some cinnamon on top of the area. That's been known to be a deterrent for fungus gnats. Or You just kind of learn to live with them. If you have a lot of fungus gnats, it probably shows that your soil is too wet and the area around your plants might be too humid. So use them as a little bit of a warning sign, and it shouldn't be too big an issue at all. Laura's saying Alberta Urban Garden is Stephen Legary's YouTube channel. He's the one who did the experiment showing that chlorinated water doesn't destroy soil life. Yeah, that's right. And I love Stephen's approach to testing and researching. I wish he was still making the videos, but he's not anymore. Okay, Linda's saying, I want to try growing soldaki tomatoes this year. So far, the only seed source I can find is Fedco. Any other ideas? I don't have any specific recommendations. I love Fedco. As I've mentioned before, a lot of my trees I got from Fedco. This is the time of year where you're going to start seeing a lot more seed companies adding new products. Their catalogs are going to come out. Just start doing some searches of that specific tomato type, and you might stumble across a nursery. You know, too many of us, this is my own personal way of doing it, you'll do a Google search. You'll look on the first page, find something, go to that site, and then keep surfing. And we seldom get to the third and the fourth and the fifth page on Google searches. But I've found some great nursery sources on those third and fourth and fifth searches. And so think about that as well. Just have patience, keep searching deep into Google, and you might come across some very small, maybe even a local source near you. But because they don't have the traffic and they're not as well known, they're not going to show up in the first couple pages of Google. So I've actually found some of the seeds that I've looked for over the years by just continuing to look at the different pages, page 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. By the time you get to page 10, you might not find it, but you might have the opportunity by just avoiding some of the bigger bigger seed nursery sites and find something that is very specialized, especially when you're looking for something like soldaki tomatoes. Gerald saying, I saw from other YouTube videos, pour hot water on the soil to kill fungus gnat eggs. Yes, that can work. And rather than sterilizing the soil, pouring boiling water on the soil in the beginning can be effective. But once the plants start growing, you don't want to be pouring hot water on it because you'll damage the plants. But yes, in the beginning, that can be a way to do it. Okay, let's see what else we have. I do want to point out that Jay Dixon and Heidi, as I mentioned as well, are the moderators. When they ask a question, I should say, when they answer a question, they've got a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. So if I can't get to your specific question, look for Jay and Heidi in particular. Laura Full has been very active in recent weeks, also has some great knowledge and great information. So this is a wonderful group to help out. If you're brand new and you have questions, it doesn't have to be just me answering your question. There's a lot of experienced gardeners that are participating in the chat today, and they'll be glad to help you out. Lilac is saying, I've bought seeds of asparagus. How do I plant it? When I've grown asparagus before, I'll start my asparagus seeds inside. And there should be some directions on the package. While an asparagus plant is put pretty deep into the soil, when you buy the bare roots, they'll go 6 to 12 inches into the soil. But the seeds are actually relatively shallow. And so start them just like you would any other seed in a nice seed starter mix, and a little bit of nutrition would be fine, because I don't typically move the seedlings when I'm starting something like asparagus. So when I do tomatoes or peppers, I'll start them in a seed starter mix, and then I'll move them to a potting mix. For something like asparagus, I start with a richer mix to begin, a fine potting mix, and just let them grow. And then when they get to be, I think I was transplanting my asparagus when they were about 4 to 6 inches high. You'll want to thin them out periodically as they're growing, but it's just like any other plant. You start them from seed, You put them in a nice spot to germinate, put them under lights inside, and then put them outside. They can handle cool conditions, so transplanting typically takes place in spring. I haven't started seed directly outdoors just because in my region in particular, for seeds that are shallow, they'll dry out. And so I want to be able to put the asparagus plants in specific spots because they should be spaced about 18 inches apart when you put them in your bed. So I think they're better for starting indoors. Patrick Nunnally, thank you for that super chat. I appreciate it. A nice way to start the day. And I appreciate all of you, and not only just those that give a super chat, but I will point out, and it says it in below, if you have a question that's not being answered, a super chat is a good way to catch my attention, just like Patrick did right now. So thanks so much. I appreciate that. Luciano is saying to all my fellow Americans, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I had a great Thanksgiving, and I hope you did too, Luciano. We talked last week in the chat. I introduced you to my grandson. My family was here all week. We had a wonderful time visiting and sharing each other's time. So it was so nice. One of those things I wish we could have every day, but my kids are grown up and they've got lives of their own, but it's always nice to see them. Greg Daner says, I froze my asparagus seeds for 2 weeks prior to sowing and then direct sowed. This was 5 years ago. My asparagus bed is now robust, so there are options. Thanks for pointing that out, Greg. Definitely. I have had asparagus grow. So a number of weeks ago, I was talking about growing asparagus and how most of us try to grow male-only plants, but occasionally a female plant will pop in. And if you allow your female asparagus plants to go to seed, they'll drop and you'll see new asparagus plants pop up. I've had that in some of my beds where exactly they were naturalized, they were exposed to the cold conditions. And I did the same thing. When I see new asparagus plants pop up in a bed, I'll dig them up and transplant them to get better spacing. And then you can really fill in an asparagus bed and have asparagus for decades to come. It's a wonderful perennial vegetable. Okay, Lisa Moore saying, thank you so much for your information. I can't wait for next season. Love always, Jasmine. Hi, Scott. Hi, back to you. Denver 1865, diatomaceous earth kills nematodes. Tony last week Tony O'Neill from the Simplified Gardening channel was on, and we talked a little bit about nematodes. There's good nematodes and there's bad nematodes. And diatomaceous earth is one of those things that you can get to address the creatures that you don't want in your garden. And it can kill some nematodes in addition to a lot of the other creeping insects. So I'm planning a video coming up maybe in the springtime where I'll talk more about diatomaceous earth. It's an amazing product that a lot of gardeners don't use enough. And so if you're trying to grow chemical-free, diatomaceous earth is one of those ways that you can deal with some of your pests without using chemicals. So thanks for throwing that out there, Greg. Love Always Jasmine is asking, could I grow seedlings on a south-facing window without a grow light? Yes, you can, but don't expect them to do well. Depends on the time of year. So this time of year in the northern hemisphere, there's just not enough light during the day, even in a southern-facing window, for most seedlings to get as much light as they need. If you're in the southern hemisphere, now's a great time to be growing seedlings in a windowsill because they're getting a lot of light. But as we in the north are approaching the shortest day of the year, the sunlight is decreasing every day. And so you can expect if you try to start seedlings right now, not only isn't there enough light right now, but it's going to become less and less over the course of the next month. In the spring, as the sunlight is increasing, yeah, southern-facing windows can be good for seedlings. But during the winter, also with the cold conditions that you might have next to a window, I think grow lights are a much better option if you can set that up. And it doesn't need to be a fancy grow light setup, just any lighting at all that can give you at least 6 hours. But with seedlings, you should really be aiming for 10 to 12 hours minimum of direct light. And that's why a window just doesn't supply enough this time of year. So consider getting some grow lights. And I have a couple of videos on that. I'll definitely be covering grow lights and growing under the lights much more in the months ahead. Mary's saying, I'm in New Jersey. I found small snakes nesting in my garden. Should I get rid of them? I say no. Chances are they're a garter snake or bull snake. I don't know what might be native to your area. If you can determine that they're not a poisonous snake like a rattlesnake, I would leave them. In fact, I think the sign of a healthy garden environment is when snakes appear. And in my last garden, it was about the 5-year point that I first saw garter snakes in my garden, and I was extremely happy. Those snakes will take care of slugs. They'll take care of a lot of the insects that you don't want to deal with. It shows that you have a healthy environment. So I don't get rid of snakes at all. In the greenhouse at the Galileo School, there was one day I counted 11 different snakes in the greenhouse. They actually were living in the walls of the foundation over or underneath the dome greenhouse. It was a 42-foot dome greenhouse. And there were garter snakes living in the greenhouse, 11 in one day. It was a fantastic environment. And as you might guess, I didn't have any problems with slugs and many other insects. And so snakes are a great sign. If they are hazardous, sure, think about getting rid of them just so that you and others aren't exposed to them. I know some gardeners, particularly in the American South, have to worry about water moccasins and similar snakes that might be in their gardens. But New Jersey and a lot of the colder areas don't have that concern. So as long as it's a nice, safe snake, be happy that you've got snakes in your garden. I'm looking forward to the point that I have snakes in this new garden of mine. So Thanos, thank you so much for that super sticker. I appreciate that. That's also a great contribution. And I appreciate you sending it to me. Thanks so much. Lauraful saying, once we had Indiana Jones levels of garter snakes in the garden, most of them in a backpack I left outside. That's great. Again, healthy environment. And I know you've got a lot of good gardening success behind you. And so if you've got snakes, that shows you're doing things right. X Solo is saying, Gardener Scott, what can you tell us about Roundup residue in straw? Is it something we should worry about when using straw as a mulch? It's not so much the Roundup residue. Roundup, based on the laboratory research I've seen, becomes inert. It basically doesn't continue to kill very shortly after application. It's designed for live plants. But there are other chemicals that are being used on the plants that we typically get straw from, and that is becoming a bigger problem in the United States. And many of those different herbicides, pesticides that are being applied can stay in the plant for months. You can ask your source for straw if they know where the straw came from and if it was treated. But what I've found in a lot of the big box store type of operations, the ranch supply stores, that a lot of the workers, the employees, even the managers don't know where they get their straw. So anymore, you kind of have to assume that your straw is going to have some residue on it unless you specifically can find an organic straw source. And I know they're out there. I know some of you have commented about that. If you can find organic straw, and you'll pay more for it, it's not going to be treated with these chemicals. Now, I've been looking into this, preparing for a video that again, I hope to have this spring. Most, if not all, of these chemicals that are being applied to these plants will dissipate over time. And 6 months to a year is the generally end of that time. So one of the things I recommend is get your straw early. And so I'm planning actually a trip this week, maybe next week, to go get bales of straw that I'm going to be using next year. And I wanted to talk about some of this when I talk about garden planning. And I set my straw out over the winter. So by the time I use it, it's been sitting outside for at least 6 months. So a lot of that chemical residue will have naturally dissipated. It will have leached out of the straw because of the rain and the snow. And so by the time I use it, it should be mostly, if not completely, free of residue. And I have seen no indications of problems with my plants when I use straw as a mulch. So there's the quick version. Like I said, I'm planning a video where I'll talk more about some of these specific chemicals, how long they last, what kind of things you can see on your plants. But I just give it time. Get your straw early, allow those chemicals to disappear, and by the time you put them on your beds, hopefully you'll have relatively clean straw. And so Greg Daner, thank you so much for that contribution as well. A ha-ha sticker. That's a nice way to start the day as well. Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, let's see what we have popping up. Model Railroading is saying, how far away from an orchard should a tree trap crop be planted? I want to use mulberry to keep birds away from my orchard. And I think you asked this question last week, and I'm sorry I didn't get to it. So a lot of it depends on the birds and what the problem is. And so birds can fly for miles, as you probably know. And so it's one of those things that you don't have to have a mulberry close to the fruit trees, which is, I'm guessing, is what you're trying to protect. But a little farther away is okay. So a trap crop, and I talk a lot in previous videos and previous live streams, I've talked about putting plants in your garden with the intent of attracting a pest. And so a trap crop is that idea. So you put up something like a mulberry where the birds are going to go to that plant, and then that keeps them away from what you're trying to protect, like an orchard with your fruit trees. And so they have to be close enough together so that the birds aren't finding your orchard all by itself and then later flying to the trap tree. But it's one of those situations that you have to anticipate the size of the tree as well, the space it's going to take. And so I would say generally, if they're 100 feet away, that's probably a general rule of thumb to be close enough to protect the orchard, but far enough away that they're not going to be bouncing back and forth between the fruit trees and the mulberry tree. You're probably still going to need some type of protection on your fruit trees. I don't know if you use netting. I'll be using some netting on my fruit trees as they get a little bit bigger. You might need more than one mulberry tree. You might need more than one trap tree. You might want to put some other type of fruit trees depending on the bird. Now, different birds eat different things. So I actually like to attract birds to my garden, even around my fruit trees, during the nesting time, because most birds will eat insects, or they'll get the insects to feed their young. And I saw a statistic once that about 90% of bird species eat insects while they're nesting. After the young birds are grown, a lot of those birds don't eat insects anymore. So they'll move on to other things like fruit, but not all birds eat fruit. So first off, identify your birds, figure out if they have a preference for the type of fruit they eat. Mulberries may be perfect, and there might be alternative trees. So I would try to consider more than one trap tree if you have the opportunity. Put some other sacrificial tree that the birds can get to that is completely in the open, but doesn't have bird netting over it. And it's kind of like the squirrels. If you feed birds in a location away from your garden, then they're going to occupy that area, and they're less likely to keep your garden or your orchard as a primary eating spot. So a couple ideas out there. Sorry, I can't give you an exact amount, but from what I've read, 100 feet is a general idea based on the size of the plants, because you do want to keep them away. So, okay, let's see what else we have popping up here. Lorian Green says, chokecherry is our trap crop, but not on purpose. I'm actually intentionally trying to grow chokecherries exactly for that reason. On the outskirts of my garden, I've got chokecherry bushes with the intent that that'll be one of those places that the birds go. And in my case, because I've got a smaller location, that's about 50 feet away from my fruit trees, my small orchard, and I'm hoping that'll be enough. But they can have all the chokecherries they want. Yeah, definitely. That's a way to get them away, give them something that they want. Muffy 1981 is saying, my sweet potato plant indoors has so many tall sprouts, but I think it's too soon to transplant outdoors. What do I do, please? I live in Maryland. Yeah, you're going to be exposed to some cold winter conditions to come in Maryland, and the sweet potato plant isn't going to handle the outdoors. So it might be one of those situations where it's possible to continue growing indoors if you have a big enough pot for the sweet potatoes to develop. I'm also going to go out on a limb here and say you probably started the sweet potatoes indoors earlier than you should have, and so chalk it up to experience. I would consider starting sweet potatoes much later for you. Do it in early spring, so when you transplant them outside, they're not going to be exposed to the cold conditions. But you've probably got at least 3 months, if not 4, before your area is going to be warm enough to be able to handle sweet potatoes outside. And all of those sprouts probably means it need more light and it needs more growing space. So you may have to start over again with your sweet potatoes here in just a little bit. And so Linda Hardwick is on there, says, love your corn against the fence. Thank you for pointing that out, Linda. And I do want to say that it's not my corn against the fence. It's Carla Garner's corn against the fence. So Carla sent me this picture of her fence, her corn, and her garden. You can't really see it real well, but this is just as nighttime is approaching, and she has some really nice, beautiful lights underneath to light up this area. So even though it looks like it might be morning, it's actually in the evening as the lights are shining on this fence and her young corn. So thanks for pointing that out, and thank you, Carla, for showing your picture this week. And as I've mentioned before, if you want your picture as my background, send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. And I'll put you in the queue. I've got a couple others that I'll be showing in the next few weeks. And it's always nice to show not just my gardening, but other people's gardening as well. Okay. Yeah, there's Laura Full talking about the background. So I think it's a beautiful garden spot. And I had a fence like that. I grew raspberries against a fence I had like that. Using a fence as a support, you can help trellis plants. Now, corn is wind pollinated, and so you need it to be in an area where it can receive some wind. But when it gets to be taller and those stalks start blowing around, if you have heavy wind, the corn can be damaged. And so putting it in an area by a fence where it can cut down on harsh winds is a great idea. So think about that as you are developing and planning your garden. Use the structures in your garden for protection as well. It really can be one of those things that can save some of your plants. And so let's talk a little bit more about that, because I want to talk about planning today. And so it was suggested by David Rasmaneth this last week. I've got some planning videos. I've got more planning videos to come. And he suggested that I talk about planning in the live stream. So rather than a 10 or 12-minute video where I talk about just one aspect of planning. I actually use this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on planning, but also give you the opportunity to ask questions as I'm talking about my own process. So this is one of those things that's where we're going to move for probably, let's see, maybe the next half hour. We'll see how this goes and what kind of questions you have. But I want to share with you some of my basic thoughts of how I approach garden planning. And this is an ideal time. I had a video recently where I was talking about the autumnal equinox and how I really start thinking about planning my garden in the middle of fall. And I continue to do so throughout the winter. Now, when I talk about garden planning, there are many aspects of planning. And so right off the bat, most people are thinking, well, what plant am I going to grow? And that's the focus of their planning. But I'd like you to think beyond that. Think about just what plant you're going to grow. Think about where you're going to grow. And think about how you're going to grow. Those are really the three factors: where, how, and what. Because as you start looking at your next season, and it might be 1 month away, it might be 6 months away, but as you start looking at that season, figure it out ahead of time. That's how you'll have the most success. So I regularly walk through my garden at this time of year. There's no plants growing. This morning it was well below freezing. Tomorrow's going to be below freezing. I don't have plants growing in my vegetable garden at all, but I can walk through it and look at the beds and start thinking about what beds I'm going to be growing plants in. And then I can start throwing in what plants I want to start growing. And a big point in this analysis is thinking about what I just grew, what did well, what didn't do well, why they did well, and why they didn't do well. And so, for example, if you saw my videos where I had my pumpkin plants in the background, I grew pumpkin plants on my hugelkultur mound, they did great. So, as far as the where am I going to grow pumpkins this year, I'm going to grow them in the exact same spot. They did well. I liked the way they looked. And so for garden planning, I can say, I want to grow pumpkins. Where am I going to grow pumpkins? Check off the list right off the bat. That part of my garden plan is complete. Now I look at other plants that I know I want to grow. And tomatoes is a perfect example. I love growing tomatoes. This year I grew tomatoes on the horizontal trellis that I built and I showed in a few videos. They didn't do well there for a couple reasons. One being they were devastated by an early hailstorm. And then when they were starting to grow, they had reflective heat from the metal bed I built, and some of them got overheated on that side of the bed. So I'm learning from that and thinking about where am I going to grow my tomatoes this year? Well, I don't think I'm going to grow them in that bed like I built the bed for. The reflective heat and that open aspect is not good for tomatoes. So I'm going to be growing tomatoes in different beds this year where I can give them the hail protection, and they're not going to be exposed to that reflective heat. And I've already built some of the metal beds, and the main area of the beds that I'm going to continue to build will be for tomatoes. And then I'm going to cover that whole space with the hail cloth. So I want to grow tomatoes. I learned that they don't grow well in the area I had them in. I need to look for a new area, and I need to deal with some of the problems I had in protecting those plants in the new area. But now what do I do with the bed that I had for tomatoes that I'm not growing tomatoes in? Well, it's open, it's sunny, it gets a lot of heat, perfect for peppers. So I'll be growing a lot of peppers in that bed. I'm also going to be growing some green beans that can climb up that trellis. Brand new plan, but it's something I'm thinking about now, so that as I think about the peppers I'm going to be growing, I've identified that bed. Now that bed is about 20 feet long with a grow space of about 3 feet wide. I can grow a lot of peppers and beans in that space. So this is all part of the garden planning. As I'm looking at how big the bed is, now when I start my seeds indoors, I can have an idea of how many plants I'm going to need. This is how I look at garden planning. Is I just take one section of my garden at a time and I analyze it, I think about it, and that's how I determine the plants. Now, I don't necessarily need to decide what pepper seeds I'm going to buy or what pepper seeds I'm going to start. I don't need to decide that right now. Right now, I'm just trying to decide what plants and where and a general idea of how many. And Trudy's Fun, thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate that. Okay, now I'll move on to some of the other beds. My raised beds, the half dozen raised beds I have in my main growing area, same idea. What am I going to do with those beds? Now, one bed already has garlic growing in it, so I can check that off the list. That's done. But now when I start thinking about the cucumbers and the kale and the lettuce and the radish and all the other plants that I'm growing on a regular basis, I have to start thinking about what I'm going to grow in those beds. Now, I've got a great amount of flexibility because all of those beds are 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, and I've got 5 of them to plant in. So it's not critical that I determine exactly what plants go into those beds yet. I usually save that for springtime. But I do need to start thinking about what went right and what went wrong. I love spinach. This year, I didn't grow enough spinach. So now in my planning, I want to start thinking about expanding how much spinach I grow and maybe trying some new varieties of spinach as well. I found out that I actually grew too much chard. I had chard growing in 3 different beds, and I just can't eat that much chard. So I'm going to cut the chard back this year. Had great cucumber success, and I made some really nice pickling cucumbers. I thought I grew enough I put enough pickling cucumber plants in half of one bed. I wish I had way more pickling cucumbers. So this year, I'll probably start growing pickling cucumbers in at least 2, maybe 3 of the beds. Not the whole bed, but in portions of the bed. So you can see how I start approaching some of this planning. Is looking at this last year and then moving forward to, do I want to repeat some of the same actions or do I want to try some new things? So let's see if we've got any questions that are popping up right now. Trudy's Fun, good to see you. Don't worry about it being too late. Let's see. Heidi Clark is talking to Laura. Try to use some sort of soil mulch. I'll let you guys talk about that. Prepping to Survive says, hi, Scott. Danielle Fitzgerald says, me either. My fall garden didn't do so hot, but I think I started too early. So now I have a bunch of empty space in my garden. Luz is saying, is there a specific garden journal the group recommends? Yeah, let's talk about garden journals as well, because part of what I do as I'm looking back on this is refer to the garden journal. And you've heard me say this before in videos and in these live streams. A journal will help you keep track of what went right and what went wrong. Now, I like to do it this time of year, so a lot of those thoughts are fresh in my mind. But as I move through the winter, some of the memories might be mixed up a little bit, and a garden journal really helps out. Now, for me, my videos really work well for me as a journal. And I do have a couple of videos. I do have a video I recommend you look at where I talk specifically about a journal and 20 different things that you should look for in a journal. And in that video, I've got links to, I think, 3 different garden journal specific garden journals that you can look at. But ultimately, it comes down to how you choose to garden. What things are most important to you? And so when I keep track of my plants, I keep track of what I grew, how much I grew, if it was successful, if it wasn't, the weather patterns, how the weather impacted the plants, those type of things. So as far as selecting a garden planner or a garden journal for yourself, sit down and that's kind of what I talk about in that video. Highlight the most important things for you in your garden. And those are the kind of things that a garden journal should include. Weather tracking, a garden plan. So you can actually, a lot of good garden journals will actually have pages where there's a grid that you can actually draw your garden beds, and you can keep track from year to year of the beds and what you grew in the beds. I like that aspect of garden journals. And so, yeah, some of you have some suggestions for specific journals. I tend to make my own. I've got a video coming up soon where I'll talk about some of the ways that I create my own garden journal for garden planning. But you just got to write this stuff down or put it electronically in your phone or computer to just help jog your memory when you need to. Mage Grey Wolf is saying, going to get a 30 to 40 degree cold snap in Central Florida. Should we cover our plants? I would say it depends on the plant, but in most cases, especially in Florida, yes, definitely consider covering your plants. This is one of those, you have to know the plants in your garden so you know which ones are susceptible to cold damage, and those are the ones that you should cover first. A lot of the vegetables that you might have just started to grow, if you're growing lettuce and spinach and kale and chard, you're not going to need to cover those in a cold snap. But a lot of those tender perennials or tender annuals, I would say, yeah, definitely consider covering those. Carla, Garner, there you are. Thank you so much, and I hope you appreciate the background today. We need a Gardner Scott Garden Journal. Yeah, and that's kind of my intent with the video I've got coming up, is to just show you what I do for my own garden planning as far as journaling is concerned. But you never know. Maybe someday there will be an official Gardner Scott journal. I'm too busy to actually go to the effort of publishing something like that. But I appreciate the thought and I appreciate the concern. Luz is saying, in what video do you discuss the 3 journals? I think the name of the video is The Importance of a Garden Journal, or keeping a garden journal, or but garden journal is definitely in the topic. You can go to my library. I did it about a year ago. So look for videos either at the end of last year or at the beginning of this year about the importance of a garden journal, and that's where I talk about it. Brooklyn Giraffe says, hello from Brooklyn. Thanks again for another great chat. I'm learning so much today. I started a journal thanks to your video. It's both great for brainstorming and therapy. Thanks for pointing that out. The therapy part, I often talk about how wonderful gardening is, to get out in the garden. But that's an interesting point, and I completely agree with it. Keeping track of what's going well in your garden as well as what's not, keeping track of what you grew, how well it did. Yeah, that's great therapy. I completely agree. And so journaling is great for just documenting what you do and your progress as you do it. But that is often very cathartic. So great point. It is one of those things that I feel better when I put down for posterity what happened in my garden. And I've looked at some of my previous journals from years ago and come across recommendations that I gave myself that I'd completely forgotten about. And I see it again and it's like, oh, wow, yeah, that's great therapy when a former self is telling you what to do right next time. And I've actually enjoyed some of that looking back on formal journals. So yeah, keep a journal. That's an interesting idea. Thanks. I appreciate that. Okay, let's see. John Jude is saying, good to note how to space our plants as I now give my tomatoes more space for how they grow better, or now they grow better as I've learned how to take care of them. Exactly. When you learn something that works, then keep doing it. And that's why I say, sometimes I've learned to do something and I keep doing it. And it's when I go back to a previous journal that I realized it was me making note in a journal that that's the way to do it. And over a period of years, you forget that it was you giving your own recommendation. But that's a huge benefit to journaling, is you can keep doing that every single year. And eventually, you're just building on success. And that's one of the best ways to garden. Danielle's asking how the holiday was with your family. I talked about that at the very beginning of the live stream today. It was wonderful. I had a wonderful time spending all the days with my family. Thanks so much for asking. Thanksgiving is a wonderful time of year to get family together. Jay Dixon is saying, reminder, there's merchandise for Cyber Monday Christmas gifts. See the link under the video halfway down. And actually, I'm going to point this out right now. I want to go ahead and give all of you a special reduction. If you're at all interested in the Gardner Scott merchandise, you'll see it in some of the links underneath this as the YouTube merchandise store. You can also go to a link in the description where you can go get some of the Gardner Scott merchandise. But if you use the GS2020 at checkout, you'll get a 15% discount. And I've got that set up for the entire month of December. So you guys are so great. I appreciate all of your support. I know some of you have already got Gardner Scott merchandise. I've got a ton of it. I wear it in my videos. And if it's something you're interested in and you want to do it for yourself or as a gift, it's an option. No pressure at all. Please don't think that this is commercial and I'm trying to sell my stuff, but I do know that there's a lot of you that have interest in this. So if you have interest, use the GS 2020 at the merchandise store and get yourself 15% savings. And I hope that helps you out as just an option. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up here. There's some other things I wanted to talk about when it talks about your garden planning, and it gets to the seeds. And I mentioned a little bit about this earlier. One of the reasons I like to think about planning right now. So I talked about I might be growing different types of spinach because I didn't grow enough spinach. Well, you can use a lot of the seeds that you got this year, earlier in the year, they're going to be fine to use next year. But if you find yourself wanting to grow something new or more of something and you don't have the seeds, now's the time to start thinking about those seeds. Last week in our conversation between me and Tony, we were talking about seeds. And as he said, he's already got all of his seeds for this next season. And I want a few more, but for the most part, I already have my seeds as well. There is a chance that there could be another seed shortage this year because a whole bunch of people became gardeners this year. And if they stick with it, which I hope they do, and I hope if you're a new gardener, you're going to stick with it as well, you're going to need to get some seeds. Many of the nurseries, at least in my area, haven't started stocking their seeds yet. The big box stores aren't going to be stocking seeds probably till February. But if you want your seeds, don't wait that long, because if you wait until the big stores stock them, then you're going to be limited by just what's available in the store. And as you become a better gardener and as you become more knowledgeable, you're going to want to try specific varieties like we talked about at the beginning with looking for a very specific tomato. If you're looking for specific plants, you may only be able to find those online. And there are millions of people buying seeds online. If you wait, it might be sold out. So that's why I want to start talking about planning this early, because when you look at what you did, when you look at what you want to do and seeds enter the picture, you may have to start ordering seeds in December. Definitely January. I try to have all of my seeds in place by the end of January so that I can start seeds indoors if I need to. I can have a more precise plan once I have my seeds in hand, and I don't have to worry about frustration by trying to find the special seed because I waited too long. So think about it, as I mentioned in the video that I did last week with gardening gifts, seeds. If you have someone in your life that wants to buy you gardening gifts, seeds might be the perfect resource. So tell them what you're looking for, tell them where to go, but definitely try to get your seeds as early as possible. And now's a great time to do it. Yannette is saying, I looked through various garden journals and then selected the sections I liked and created my own journal. Great idea. And that's why I say I like I like the grids for drawing your patterns. I like having weather options so you can track the weather. I like some of the open spaces. One of the things I'm not as big a fan of is just blank pages. I like to have directions. Sometimes I have so much to write down that I need some structure. So I actually like the journals that give you the specific days or at least weeks, because it kind of forces you to write something down on a regular basis, or else you see too much white space. But definitely, yeah, look at different journals, figure out what works best for you, and create your own. That's why I don't recommend specific journals, because I think everybody has a different way of doing things. You might like a bunch of blank pages and just freewheel your approach to the garden planning and the garden analysis and journaling. So think about how if you've ever kept a diary, if you've ever kept a journal, how did you do that? And that might be a great way to start your garden journaling as well. Redneck Butchers, do chemical fertilizers kill soil life or just not feed them? It depends. It depends on the chemical. It depends on the soil life. Soil life, and I was watching a video yesterday about the soil food web, and it's one of those things that there's so much to it that you really have to think about it as a major operation. There are thousands of different types of bacteria and fungi, and the way that plants use the nutrients in the soil. And it's all nature, and how all of these different microorganisms and plants work together. So one of the biggest issues with chemical of any type, but chemical fertilizers in particular, is they kind of disrupt that system. And so a plant uses photosynthesis for its own growth, but a major part of that photosynthesis is developing the sugars that are then secreted through the roots. Those are called exudates. And so the exudates, those sugars that go into the sugar, now act as not only a binding agent for soil, but also food for some of these microorganisms. And it's these microorganisms that take the organic matter and the bacteria and the fungi, everything living in the soil, they'll eat it, and then they'll make it available for plant roots. So when we talk about nitrogen in soil, the plants really don't use nitrogen. They use ammonium, and we need a bacteria to convert the nitrogen into that form that a plant can use. Well, most of these liquid fertilizers that you see will list ammonia or ammonium as the nitrogen component, which means it's, in most cases, immediately available for the plant. That's why fertilizers work so well. Well, that's great for the plant, but it isn't good for the soil life, because the soil life, all that bacteria, all those fungi, they're feeding upon the material, and then they're making that ammonium for our plants. So if we disrupt that cycle by putting in a chemical, essentially we are robbing those microorganisms of the opportunity to do that. So yes, they will die, or they will leave, or they will go dormant because they no longer serve that purpose. Now, when you stop using the chemical fertilizers, there's a gap. It's barren. Those organisms that would have been doing that job are not present because we were doing it artificially through the use of chemical fertilizers. So it's not so much that the fertilizers will kill the organisms outright. It just disrupts the whole system to the point that they will die or they will stop doing that action. And it takes time for all of that to develop again, all of that to grow. And that's one of the reasons why if you are dependent on fertilizers and your plants do great, but then you stop fertilizing, your plants suffer because there's no in between. The soil life quit working because you usurped it. So that's a big reason why I don't use chemicals. If you just let the system work and let it reach its own equilibrium, its balance between bacteria and fungi and organic matter, you won't need any chemical fertilizers because nature takes care of all of it. Muffy 1981, good to see you again. Thank you. Error with planting sweet potatoes too early in my zone, and many other tips. Will definitely start a journal. Good. Thank you for that contribution, that super chat. It's one of those things that we do. Sometimes we learn the hard way, and planting sweet potatoes in late fall indoors is one of those lessons. So thank you for sharing that. I know it's hard to sometimes admit, but when you learn and you try it and you do it better the next time, especially when you journal it, there's a great way to start a journal. Hey, guess what I did, future self? And then you can learn from it. Thanks for sharing that. Donielle is saying, do you recommend adding worms to an apartment container garden on a second floor balcony? Yeah, actually I do. And I've done things like this before. Now, as far as adding worms, I do not advocate buying worms and putting them in your garden in most cases. Instead, what I do, after a rain, if I see earthworms starting to crawl up on the surface or they get stuck on the sidewalk, I'll go out and rescue them and then introduce them into my garden or into my pots. And I've done that on balcony gardens as well with the worms that are crawling around in my on my sidewalks. Those are the worms that I use. There's a number of reasons for it. Basically, there are different types of worms. And so the worms that you have naturally in your landscape and garden fall into three basic types as to how deep they burrow and how much cold they can handle. And so if you buy like red wigglers that we use in vermicomposting, like if you have worms in a bin in your basement, those worms can't handle very cold conditions at all. Below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, about 10 degrees Celsius, they shut down and they'll start dying if they haven't died before that point. So if you buy worms and put them outside on a balcony, especially moving into cold weather, you'll probably kill your worms. Any worms that are crawling around on the sidewalk in your area, most cases will be able to handle the weather and the temperatures in your area. So yeah, by all means, use your own native worms for your own beds and your pots. They might die, but in the meantime, before they die, they'll eat some of that organic material and they'll make worm castings for you. So you don't have to buy worm castings. I regularly repopulate areas when I find worms crawling around. Okay, and you're welcome, Danielle. Thanks for that. Let's see what else we have. Yeah, rescue kidnapped worms, Gerald says. I do think of it as rescue. How many times have you walked on a sidewalk and seen all those dried up worms? If they're not rescued, they're going to be dead either from a bird or because they're going to dry out after the rains stop. So I like to keep them. Now, worms are amazing. I was thinking about this because I answered a similar question on a video comment earlier today. Worms will find your garden. If you have organic matter in your soil, the earthworms will find it. At the Galileo Garden, we had 26,000 square feet. They used to be tennis courts covered in asphalt. The whole area was surrounded by a concrete base that was very thick. And it was a relatively sterile environment when we first started. It was compacted rock and sand and granite, what you would put underneath tennis courts. Well, over time, we amended the soil, threw in a lot of organic material, a lot of leaves, leaf mold, compost, and the soil became much richer than it ever was before. I took some of those worms that I rescued from the sidewalk and put them into beds, but in one area in particular where I was planting fruit trees, when it came time to dig the holes for the fruit trees, now granted, it was a year before we amended that area with a whole bunch of organic matter. And then a year later, I planted the fruit trees. There were thousands of worms in that space. Many more worms than could have repopulated from the handful that I put in some of the beds. So the worms somehow crawled underneath all of that concrete, through terrible soil, and discovered all of that rich organic material in the bed. So I'm completely convinced that if you give them an environment that they like, they will find it, because I've seen it happen. Even in my current garden, where most of my soil is very poor in nutrients and organic matter, I've found worms in areas that I didn't put them. I just put the wood chip mulch down, came back later to plant a plant, and I discovered worms. So mulches and organic matter will definitely get worms to your garden. New York Unix Guru, I think that's what that is, says worms like cardboard too. Yeah, the paste that holds the cardboard together, I've seen some little bit of research, not official research, just people doing tests, that the worms love that, a lot of that paste in cardboard. And then as the cardboard decomposes, they'll eat that material as well. So just give them something to eat and the worms will find it. Nana says, worms like classical music. You know, I remember seeing something about that. I will not necessarily confirm nor deny that, but I've heard that as well. Malat says, rescuing native worms is such a great idea. I'm a balcony gardener too, so it's a great tip. Great. I hope you can use it to your benefit. And so this is another one of those things that you could put in your journal. I've definitely kept track as I find worms. I've got 6 beds, and I have added worms as I found them to 3 of them. And so this year, I'm looking forward as I put plants in all the beds, if I'm going to find worms in those other 3, because it shows that the worms have migrated and that I'm starting to develop some healthy soil in those beds. Another great thing to keep track of, to throw to your journal, and you can keep track of the population as well. I've noticed that in the very first bed that I started growing in this year, I put soil in it last year and then started growing in it this year, and there were worms in it at the beginning of this year. The other beds that I put soil in and started growing in this year, at the end of the season, I started finding a few worms in those other 2. So we'll see. It's just such an amazing creature, and they do so much for the soil that might as well keep track of them as one of those successes and beneficial aspects of your garden. Trudy's Fun says, can you explain the difference of making pure leaf mold as opposed to just adding leaves to break down with other organic material? And so the video that I released yesterday talked about how to make leaf mold. Now, when you make compost, it is usually a blend of materials. And so I will add leaves to my compost pile, along with banana peels and cut grass and tomato plants and everything else. It's just a mix of different ingredients, and it will break down. And in compost, we're looking for a blend of the greens and the browns, the nitrogen and the carbon. And those mixes, those balance of the green and the brown, influence the bacteria in that pile. And it's that bacteria that breaks down that organic material. And so bacteria is most often the primary decomposer of green materials like leaves, or grass leaves and banana peels and coffee grounds and all those other things we think of as green materials. Bacteria will also break down those same materials once they've turned brown, but now it becomes a carbon source. But when it comes to leaves and wood chips and other tree-based materials, it's not the bacteria that is decomposing that material, it's the fungi that's decomposing that material. And so that's a key difference right off the bat between compost and leaf mold. Leaf mold is primarily decomposed by fungal strands that are growing through those leaves, while the compost is primarily decomposed by bacteria. Now, there will be both in a compost pile or in a leaf mold pile, but fungi can't handle some of those hot temperatures. So when we're making hot compost, where it's reaching 160 degrees Fahrenheit, that's somewhere around 60, I think 65 degrees Celsius, maybe hotter than that. It's killing fungal spores and the fungus as well. And so you're not going to see fungus breaking down material in a compost pile. Leaf mold is going to be much cooler. The fungus is growing at a much slower pace, much cooler temperatures. And that's one reason why leaf mold takes so long to decompose. Compost will be ready in a couple months, especially if you turn it, keep it moist, and have that balance of greens and browns. Leaf mold is just leaves decomposing by the fungal action over a long period of time. Now, you might have seen some videos out there where they'll talk about how to get your leaf mold faster. And in most cases, what they're doing is they're adding a nitrogen source of some type. So they're adding chicken manure. And so the back to Eden method with wood chips and chicken manure, that's one of the reasons why that soil becomes so rich, because the nitrogen, the ammonium in the chicken manure is helping to break down that wood product through bacterial action more often. And it also adds a boost to the fungus. You can also use other nitrogen-rich products to quicken your leaf mold. That's okay. If you start adding some of those mixes, you can still call it leaf mold, but it's not a pure leaf mold. And one of the advantages of leaf mold that I talked briefly about in the video is that the material that results is different as far as the structure to compost. So compost is a nice rich material loaded with nutrients. It absorbs a lot of water. Well, the leaf mold can actually absorb more water than a typical compost, maybe 10 times its weight as far as how much water it can hold. It's not going to have all of the nutrients. It will have some nutrients from whatever type of leaf you used. Leaves tend to have more minerals than our compost material, and that will be available through the leaf mold. But it's really a way to build the structure of your soil. It's still organic. Earthworms will still use it as food along with a lot of other microorganisms, but it's really a way to make your soil looser, retain more moisture, and add some more mineral components. So there you have it. Those are some of the primary differences between compost and leaf mold. Leaf mold is not used much in the United States, but if you watch a lot of British gardening channels with their videos, you'll see they use a lot of leaf mold. And I'm definitely going to be using it more in my garden, and I'll have more videos to come talking about it as well. Gerald is saying, speaking of fungal, I was curious about growing mushrooms in a garden. Those ready-made grow kits, are they worth it? Sure. You'll often need a specific type of wood to match the type of mushroom. And so when you look at some of those kits, you'll see that they recommend growing in an oak log or whatever it might happen to be. That's a little limiting if you have a specific type of fungus or mushroom that you want to grow. But yeah, definitely. They're going to need a nice, humid, usually shady environment. So if you've got the right environment for them, I say go for it. Mushrooms are another good sign in your garden. Like we were talking about snakes earlier. When I see mushrooms in my garden, I know I have fungal growth. And so we talk a lot about compost. We talk a lot about the bacteria in soil. Well, the fungi are just as important. They play a critical role in getting the nutrients from the soil to the roots of the plant. The mushrooms are the fruit of the fungus. So when you see mushrooms in your garden, don't think you have to kill the mushrooms. You can throw them in your compost pile if you want, but it shows you've got good fungal action in your soil, which is an indication of some developing healthy soil. Ideally, you want a mix. You want about half fungal activity and half bacterial activity in a really good, healthy soil in your garden. So another reason for using the leaf mold, because it's so fungally dominant, when you mix it into your soil along with compost, which is bacterial dominant, it really helps to balance out the life within your soil. Frank Gibson says wine cap mushrooms are the easiest thing in the world to grow. Thanks for suggesting that. That's definitely something to consider. Last year I had thought about growing mushrooms and forgot all about it. Another reason to keep a journal. I should have written down that I wanted to grow mushrooms, because as I was looking at all my seed packages and everything else, I forgot all about the mushrooms. So hopefully I'll grow some mushrooms this year if I can remember to write it down and put it in my garden plan. Hi, Jeff. Glad you made it as well before the end. We still have a little bit of time before we get to the philosophy phase. Laurelful says, minimize your exposure to fungal spores. Too much can cause an allergy or farmer's lung. That's true. When you do see the mushrooms growing, it's the fruiting body. And so once the mushrooms get a little bit bigger, they're going to release their spores through the wind, or some of them actually kind of explode and they pop into the air. So when I see mushrooms, I will cut them and throw them in my compost pile. You can definitely leave them in place for those spores to spread. But if you've got a lot of mushrooms, yes, you could be breathing in those spores and you might find that you have an allergy to them. So thanks for pointing that out. That could be a concern. John Ann says, talking buying seeds, who has the best sales today? I've seen a bunch of sales popping up. I noticed that Stark Brothers is having some sales. They have a buy one, get one. I did this last year. I knew I was going to be buying a lot of trees from Stark Brothers, actually fruit bushes more so. And today's the last day they have a kind of a 2-for-1. So if you buy a gift certificate at Stark Brothers, you'll get the same amount of a gift certificate. So buy a $50 gift certificate and you get $100 worth of products. And that's what I did last year, is I bought myself a bunch of gift certificates because it was essentially 2-for-1 today. I've also seen Greenhouse Megastore has a lot of supplies along those lines. But as far as the seed companies, I think just about every seed company online has some type of sale. At least all the ones that I subscribe to, they have some type of sale going on today. So definitely get online and start looking for some of your seeds today, because good point, Cyber Monday, there's a lot of online seed sales going on right now. Kathleen saying, how do I rid my compost pile of baby slugs? I live in Washington State, 8B, lots of rain, lots of slugs. Get snakes. We talked about this earlier. One of the best way to get rid of slugs is snakes. So if you've got a healthy snake environment, they'll get rid of slugs. Ducks is another great way of get rid of slugs. Ducks in particular. If you've got the space, I know people that have ducks to get rid of their slugs. They can damage the plants, of course, but at least they get rid of slugs. The other thing that I tend to do, I don't have a big slug problem, but when I see a slug, I pick it up and I actually will toss it into the compost pile buried. But if you see them around your compost pile, one of the things you can do is just turn your compost pile. They will die and decompose and add nutrients to your compost pile. So that's one thing you can do. I'm not a big fan of using some of the the chemical poisons like the slug pellets. If you can dry out the area, that'll also deal with the slugs, but you'll probably have baby slugs popping up because they'll be breeding in those wet conditions. You can set some traps. I've talked about this in previous streams as well. If you put wet cardboard on the ground, especially near your area where you've got a slug problem, they're going to crawl underneath that wet cardboard overnight. And you can just pick the wet cardboard up in the morning, or wet newspaper, a roll of newspaper does the same thing. And you can throw them in the trash because they'll be collected either underneath that cardboard or that newspaper. So those are some of the easy ways that I deal with it. Barb says, nope, nope, nope to snakes. Now, snakes can be great for your garden. I have to admit, especially like in the greenhouse where I had all those snakes, I knew I had snakes. Every single time I saw a snake, it still made me jump. So I haven't improved my ability to calmly approach snakes, because when I see a snake, it still makes me jump. But it does show a healthy environment. Jeff says, I used to see snakes in my yard years ago, but I haven't seen them for at least 10 years. Interesting. So I've seen a lot of that happening with a lot of environments and a lot of animals. Hopefully you can get some of those snakes back. It's kind of like the earthworms. If you build the environments that they like, they'll find it. The same with frogs and toads. I gave my son a toad house, or talked about toad houses and gave him a toad house. He lives in Louisiana, a lot more toads than we have here in Colorado. But one day he went out and there was a toad living in the toad house. It's crazy how you can build an environment for these animals and they'll find it. It's just the way nature works. So I'm still building my environment, still getting my system to a balance point. I don't expect to see a lot of these type of animals, but someday I will. Okay, let's go ahead and get to that point where we talk a little bit about philosophy. Mondays always go so quickly, and I appreciate you hanging out this whole time. And another reminder, let's go ahead and show it up. If you did come late, I do want to point out the banner at the bottom. I'll go ahead and take it away now. But 15% off merchandise if you use that Garner Scott 2020, GS 2020 code, and I hope you do consider it. So, as we move through the winter, we're not growing a lot of things. Even if you're in the Southern Hemisphere and you're approaching your summer and you are growing lots of things, there's always so much information that we want to know. We want to watch more Garner Scott videos. We want to read more blogs. We want to get more books. We want to talk to more gardeners. We want to learn. We want to do more. And so I've had some people ask me in various forums, basically, at what point do you finally know enough? And that's what I want to talk about today is, can you ever know enough or too much when it comes to gardening? A lot of it is how you approach it. So for me, I've been gardening for 3 decades. I've taught hundreds of classes to kids and adults. I do all these videos. I still don't think I know nearly enough about gardening. There's always more to learn. And this is one of those fears that I think a lot of new gardeners have. They try it. It doesn't go as well as planned. They know that there's so much more they need to know because they hear someone like me that says, oh, I need to know more. And they give up or they do less when it comes to gardening. Well, that's what I want to say today is don't be afraid of gardening without all the knowledge that you think you need, because I'm still growing plants. I'm still trying new things. I'm still out in my garden growing, and I don't have all the answers. You might think I have all the answers. I don't. I have a lot of information in my head, but I don't have all the information. But I'm still out there doing it. I'm still growing plants. Even when it's a plant I've never grown before, I'm doing it. I'll do research. I'll try to find out what I think I need to know, and then I do it. And then once it starts growing, this is when reality sets in, and I realize, Well, no, I guess I didn't know enough for success with this plant. And this is where the garden journal comes in, especially when you're trying new things. You keep track of what works. You keep track of what doesn't work. You keep track of what you think might work better in the future. And this is what's so great about gardening. And that's why I think it's just, it keeps you alive. It keeps your brain active because you're always thinking about what worked, what didn't work, and what can be better next time. So don't doubt your own lack of knowledge. I try not to doubt my lack of knowledge. There will be times someone asks me a question and I don't know it. That happens. But now that becomes a catalyst for me to now learn what it was I didn't know. So don't be thinking that you don't know enough about gardening to move forward, or you don't know enough about gardening to try something new, or you don't know enough about gardening to build a new bed. Just go ahead and do it. Go ahead and plant and build and keep growing, because that's one of the best ways to acquire the knowledge that you'll need. Now, I grow pretty good tomatoes. I love the tomatoes I grow. I've got a bunch of videos on how to transplant tomatoes and prune tomatoes and trellis tomatoes. I don't consider myself a tomato expert by any measure. Every year I learn something new about tomatoes. Every year I try something different. Every year is a new year when it comes to growing my tomatoes. I do the same with all the other plants, and that's what I encourage you to do. That's what I recommend. Just keep learning, keep trying, keep building that experience, keep journaling, keep doing all of those things that we gardeners love to do, and don't get wrapped up around how much you know. By just watching a couple of my videos, listening to this live stream, you've already learned something that other people don't know because they didn't watch the same live stream or the same video. That gives you a step up on other gardeners who aren't approaching it the same way. You're trying to learn more. That's why you're on this live stream. That's why you are asking questions. That's why you're paying attention when the answers are given. You want to learn more. Keep doing it. Keep learning more. Get some books for the holidays. Ask people to add to your library. Watch more videos, not just my videos. There's lots of other great videos out there. Start subscribing to a blog, but just keep learning, because it never ends. You'll be an expert gardener at some point, and you'll still be striving for more information. And so I point out Heidi and Jay, for instance. I think Heidi and Jay are filled with garden knowledge. And both of them still ask me questions. They're good questions, but they're the kind of questions that they want to improve their gardening game, to take them to that next level. And that's what I'm talking about. Figuring out what you need to know right now and see if you can learn more about it. And then do the gardening, because when you do the gardening, you'll realize that there were questions you hadn't even thought of yet. And then you start asking those questions and you start learning more. So don't worry that you don't know enough. We all know enough. We may not know as much as we think we'd like to know, but you know enough to get out there. You know enough to put some seeds in the ground. You know enough to water them. And you know enough that you like the gardening. And you like hanging out with other gardeners like on this channel. You like getting to the point where you want to become a better gardener. So just do it. Just get out there and keep pressing forward. I'll keep doing videos. I'll keep doing these live streams. I'll keep doing what I can to give you a lot of that information. Just suck it up. And what I mean suck it up is not like, hey, suck it up. I mean suck in all of that information so that you can use it to your benefit in your future gardening. That's what it's all about. So learn, 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 and that'll make you better at this whole gardening game. So there you have it today. That's that little bit of philosophy that I wanted to throw at you. Trudy says, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, and that's okay. Great way to bring all of that into a single sentence. You're exactly right. You don't know what you don't know until you learn that you don't know it. And one of the ways to learn that you don't know it is just to get out there and do it. I had the video recently where I showed some of the things that went wrong in my garden this year. You got to do that for yourself. What went wrong, what went right, learn from it, and just keep doing it, because this is just so much fun. What better hobby could you have? What better passion can you attain than gardening? And especially when you can share your time with all these other great gardeners that we have on the live stream today and that are here every Monday. This is just a fantastic way to spend the day, to start the gardening week, and to get ready for your next season. I'll be talking more about planning in the weeks ahead. And so start thinking about the questions that you want to ask, specific issues when it comes to planning and seeds. And then we're going to get to the seed starting. And then before you know it, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's going to be spring and we're going to be planting outside. It's going to be here before you know it. Thank you for joining me today and joining all the rest of us. I hope you have a great gardening week. I'm having a pretty warm day today, so I'm headed out to the garden to water my plants, because even though we have freezing days or freezing nights, some of our days are actually pretty warm and the plants still need water down at the roots because the ground hasn't frozen yet. So if you're in a cold area and the days above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, I suggest you get out there and think about watering your plants before the ground freezes. Thanks for being here. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your support, and I will see you here next Monday at the same time. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.